Chapter 22 is the first of the significant departures from the first edition of August 1914 in 1971 to the second edition in the late 80s. The first edition has Chapter 22 in it, but says that Chapter 22 has been omitted at the author's request. The second edition has the chapter, though the chapter had been published in the mid-1970s as a chapter in the book entitled Lenin in Zurich. So Solzhenitsyn had completed the chapter for the original book, it seems, but omitted it for one reason or another. But 4 short years later, he published the chapter and made it obvious in the book, Lenin in Zurich, that the chapter was indeed Chapter 22 of August 1914. Why did Solzhenitsyn do this? What made him omit the chapter in 1971 but publish it in 1975? My best guess on this is this. Chapter 22 is an attack on Lenin, or rather an accurate description of Lenin's miserable, tyrannical soul. The normal position of reformers in the Soviet Union and elsewhere has been to criticize Stalin and to say that Stalin had betrayed the just and pristine aspirational revolution of Lenin and the early Bolsheviks. Solzhenitsyn was a major Russian writer of the post-Soviet or post-Stalinist era who challenged this thesis most directly. Solzhenitsyn challenged that thesis especially in Volume 1 of the Gulag Archipelago, the classic and seminal work on the Soviet system of justice. One of the themes of Volume 1 of the Gulag Archipelago is that Stalin had not created the system of government terror, but rather it was present at the creation of the Soviet system. Its creator was Lenin, and it is the byproduct of the Bolsheviks' totalitarian ideology. Volume 1 of the Gulag Archipelago was published in 1973. So we have a timeline of sorts. August 1914, published without Chapter 22, is published in 1971. Gulag Archipelago, Volume 1 of which was published in 1973, subjects Lenin to scathing criticisms. And then Lenin in Zurich is published in 1976, displaying for the world to see the omitted chapter on Lenin's reaction to the outbreak of World War I. Could it be that Solzhenitsyn had faith that the evidence of the Gulag Archipelago would prepare the world to hear the truth about Lenin in August 1914? In any event, the fact that Solzhenitsyn included a chapter on Lenin and how he greeted the outbreak of World War I in August 1914 shows that as he was writing about the outbreak of World War I, he was thinking about the Bolshevik Revolution as well. The loss at Tannenberg is one of those knots, those critical events that leads to the Russian Revolution. Obviously, things could have been otherwise, but they were not otherwise. Tannenberg lays bare the conclusion that the Tsarist regime is not suited for the modern world, that it is sick and decadent, that it must either be replaced or reformed seriously, either by sympathetic Russian patriots or by radicals and revolutionaries. It is not a question of whether it will be reformed, it is a question of how the reform will be conducted and who will be conducting it. Thus, what we see in August 1914 is very interesting, because the book is chock full of reformers and revolutionaries, those sympathetic to the cause of Russia and hoping to make her better at achieving her aims, and those who would destroy Russia, hoping for something new and hopefully better. In the whole Red Wheel series, I might say that these two positions are represented by Vortenstev, the sympathetic reformer on the one hand, and Lenin, the radical revolutionary on the other. So, we should see the series, and indeed this book, August 1914, as the opening in the series of such an investigation. We should be following the actions of Vortenstev very closely, for he recognizes the sickness and offers remedies. We shall see later in the volume, Vortenstev is an August 1914 version of an earlier reforming statesman, Pyotr Stolypin, who was the greatest hope for reform of Russia as opposed to revolution. While chapter 22 presents us with the first vision of Lenin, though not the first vision of radical reform and the ideology that goes along with it, let us take a few steps back to recall some of the radical sentiments already explored in the book. We have seen way earlier in chapter 8 that the son of the pious and prosperous Russian peasants, Roman, dabbled in politics and desired reform or revolution. It isn't clear. He was more radical than the constitutional Democrats, it is written. But who was there to the left of the constitutional Democrats? The socialists? Roman admired Maxim Gorky, the Stalinist sycophant, who heaped scorn on the great merchants and industrialists. The socialists, however, marauded the countryside, killing landowners and extracting ransom to fund their revolutionary activities. For some reason, all Russia felt that these dangerous revolutionaries had right on their side, Solzhenitsyn writes. This is how Roman felt at any event. The feeling among the educated society was that it was everyone's moral duty to aid the cause of revolution, a sacred obligation to the exploited people of Russia. If only there had been a lawful revolution to unseat the hated Tsar, Roman would have supported it with every means at his disposal. The socialists, however, appeared to be terrorists, unwilling and unable to build something just, to be people who could destroy the well-functioning and the ill-functioning elements of society alike, to be people who would flatter the human capacity for building a just society while committing acts of murder remorselessly. Something held Roman back from joining the socialists. Perhaps we see this in chapter 15, the more detailed treatment of the revolutionary aspiration, where we have seen briefly the doctor, a traditional reformer who seeks to repair the wounds of soldiers on the front line, confronts the revolutionary ensign, Lenartovich, whose motto, if we remember, is "the worse, the better." The worse the war goes for individual Russians, the more death, disease, the more disorganized the army, the fewer patients the doctor can save and succor, the more likely the Tsarist regime is to be replaced, and the closer we will get to just revolutionary change. We will bring about this revolutionary change, transform the condition of the peasants and the workers, put a party in charge that has their best interests understood and in mind, in the long view. What we have here in chapter 15, in the person of Lenartovich, is the first exposure to communist ideology, one of the great themes of Solzhenitsyn's works. I want to put a fine point on what is wrong with communist ideology here. It does not recognize the imperfection of human beings. The evil inside every human being cannot be expelled, and hence no person or party can be trusted to remake the world in light of justice or goodness or whatever. Reforms will take on the form of the vices of those reformers as much as their virtues. Ideology locates the evil in the world as in its ephemeral or changeable characteristics. In reality, however, evil runs through every human heart. This is a moving and self-limiting and self-mortifying idea. The problem is that Lenartovich cannot be trusted to build better. No one can be trusted to build better. One can see this problem immediately upon our introduction to Lenin in chapter 22. Lenin, as Solzhenitsyn tells us near the beginning of the Gulag archipelago, desired to purge the Russian land of all kinds of harmful insects, and he did not mean locusts. Lenartovich the ensign captures this spirit in his conversation with the doctor. This dehumanization of people would not stop once the old regime collapsed. It is sewn into the ideological view at the heart of communism. Lenin would also initiate the policy of holding people hostage in order to terrorize or wreak vengeance on a rebellious population, as Solzhenitsyn shows academically in Gulag Archipelago, Volume 1, Chapter 2. And that account is assumed in the account of Roman from August 1914. There is much to say about Lenin in Chapter 22. Let it suffice to discuss only his conclusion, namely that the slogan for socialist revolutionaries is to, quote, convert the war into a civil war, end quote. Only by this will the world war be made a gift from history. This is a radicalization of the worse the better. Because a civil war is worse than a war among countries, it cuts at the heart of civic friendship and trust. Precisely why Lenin wanted the Civil War to become the product of a world war. Lenin calls the war a red wheel. The engine of history will turn and gather speed. This is the name of the series that begins with August 1914, the Red Wheel series. German slogans like Jedem Russ ein Schuss, for every Russian a bullet. These slogans warm Lenin's heart. The revolutionary spirit seemed to have died in 1905. Why this is the case is discussed later in the book. But that is why Lenin greets the war with such hopes. After 1905, he had hoped for great things. But what he got was constitutional government, domestic peace, property rights, slow reform in the direction of liberal democracy. For Lenin, this was the accumulated filth of peacetime. Party after party, segment of the socialist after segment of the socialists, made their peace with this new order. They were happy enough with the changes in the direction of liberal democracy. Solzhenitsyn writes of Lenin, from 1908, when the revolutionary rabble had tightened its grip on the whole country, the underground had shriveled to nothing. The workers had swarmed like ants out of their holes and into legal bodies, trade unions, mutual aid societies, and the decline of the underground had sapped the vitality of emigration too, produced it to a hothouse existence. Back there in Russia was the Duma, a legal press. That is why the outbreak of the war is such a marvelous thing, end quote. It would force the regime, the Tsarist regime, to protect itself against its enemies. Force the enemies underground and abroad, build their core back up, prepare the ground for a pure and unrelenting socialist revolution. Anything to upset the happiness and tranquility. Anything to upset the accumulated filth of reformed Russia. The war would bring out the weakness of the Tsarist Russia and be a cause of great suffering. And Lenin hoped to bring that suffering home and to expand it so that the future could be made brighter and the causes of human suffering be removed. The worse, the better. We see that elements of Russian society held Lenin's view, and we see that this view becomes more prominent in the Red Wheel series itself. Let me close by saying just one thing about the big picture. Lenin refers to the victory of the reactionary rabble in 1908. That is the year that Stolypin emerges to reform Russia. He, Lenin, recognizes Stolypin as his greatest opponent and his spirit of patriotic reforms. As Lenin leaves Russia at the outset of the war, he announces that he is the anti-patriot. The Germans are not the only destructive force on Russian soil, nor are they necessarily the most destructive force. Solzhenitsyn turns to the Germans immediately after his treatment of Lenin. He turns to them in chapters 23 and 24, about which more in the next video.